Okay, we're going to talk about the tetrapods and how they came to be in the different groups of tetrapods. And so we're going to describe these. These are the land vertebrates. They have four legs, and somehow they came from fish. They came from the other vertebrates, and so we'll see. Um, the most primitive group of the tetrapods are the amphibians. Most of these are legless animals with four legs. They get their oxygen from a very simple lung, and but also from their skin and from their throat in their mouth. They have an unusual circulatory system where their heart is partially divided so that oxygen is some of that blood is going to go to the lungs and some is going to go to the rest of the body. So they have these unusual pulmonary veins that are kind of mixing blood in the heart. And then they have completely aquatic reproduction. They produce a simple egg that develops into a larvae that later that larvae goes through a metamorphosis where they develop legs. And so amphibians are somewhat aquatic. And we think they came from a group of bony fish, the Sarcopterygia. These are the bony fish that have muscles and bones within their fins. So we call them the lobe fin fish. And they also have not only bony skeleton, but they have bony scales, a swim bladder that's homologous to our lung, develops from the same tissue, and then a bony gill covering called the operculum. There's only 7 living forms, but there is a bigger fossil record of them. And the reason we think that they're linked to the amphibians is because of the structure of their limbs and head. That the lobe-finned fish, instead of having bony rays like a bluegill or a perch might have, they have a single bony ray coming out of a limb girdle, like a pectoral girdle or a pelvic girdle, that then spreads out into hard bony elements that are moved by muscle. Okay, and so you see the lobed fin fish limbs in the upper picture there, and then you see the early amphibian limbs, which look extremely similar. There's also similarities in the head, and then that similarity in reproduction. The earliest fossil amphibians are about 300 million years old, and they look remarkably like lobe-finned fish. They it's hard to determine if they were truly land animals because their fin position or their limb position is so similar to the position of these fish. The forelegs are sturdy, but the hind legs are often very flipper-like, and so we think they lived partially in and partially out of the water, much like a seal lives. Okay, they have broadly overlapping ribs that form a solid rib cage, much like a fish rib cage, and their lungs and heart would be in there. And so Ichthyostega is about 370 million years old. There's another fish from Greenland called Tiktaalik, and Tiktaalik is even more primitive and a little older, and we think he's got a limb. The fossils have an operculum, so we know he had gills, but he also had more of a neck, was a more mobile head, and his shoulder and wrist bones were those of an amphibian, but the end of the limb was a paddle. So we see a clear link between these guys and these lobe-finned fish, and we think the modern amphibian groups, the frogs and toads, Anura, the salamanders, Caudata, and then the legless amphibians, the Apoda, descended from them. There's, 5,600 species in different families, and then the 3 orders. Okay. So then how did we get the class Reptilia? Okay, these are the reptiles. And all living reptiles exhibit 3 key features. They have an amniotic egg with 4 membranes that some of which surround the embryo and or attached to it and then are enclosed in a hard but watertight shell. they have a completely dry skin, which is covered with scales that prevent it from ever exchanging oxygen, but it's very good at preventing water loss. And then instead of like frogs, which have to actually swallow air, so they use their mouth to push air down into their lungs, reptiles use thoracic breathing. So they increase the size of their thoracic cage, which draws air in. Okay, but the reptiles themselves are a pretty diverse group. Although they carry these features, they also individually, these groups can look very, very different. Probably the most important thing is that they're linked by this amniotic egg. Okay, and so their development is similar to the development of amphibians in that they go through a semi-aquatic stage, but it happens entirely within the egg. And then the nutrients for the growing embryo are contained in a yolk sac. The waste products wind up accumulating in the allantois, and then the chorion and allantois are right underneath the eggshell, and they allow some oxygen transport because oxygen can move right through the shell. And then the amnion is a fluid-filled sac that surrounds the embryo. And so these eggs can be laid far from water, and they're perfectly fine. They don't need to be laid in a pond or a stream. They'll develop in a dry environment as long as they're kept at the right temperature and have exposure to oxygen. Modern reptiles and amphibians, I should talk about them, have kind of a mixed pathway. Their blood coming back from their body, which here is shown as other capillaries, goes to the heart, and it mixes in a couple chambers, and these chambers then send it to the lungs, which are then going to send it to the rest of the body. And there's mixing of the blood in this bottom chamber that's shown kind of purple. Okay, reptiles have this, and amphibians have this kind of mixing, and I refer to that as the partially divided heart. And that's a modification of the heart of the fish. The heart of the fish just has the body capillaries coming back to the atrium, then going to the ventricle, and then pumped to the gills, and then from the gills it must go to the body. And here the lung is kind of has its own separate circulation, and so these are called the pulmonary vessels. So this is kind of a modification, and reptiles have this, and most reptiles have this amphibian-like pattern where there's the ventricle chamber has mixing, but not all reptiles. Some reptiles also have different shapes of skulls and different skull patterns, and these are really, really striking. That reptiles are distinguished by the number of holes behind the eye orbit. In some that have the anapsid skull, the back of the skeleton skull is just a solid piece of bone. Some have one opening, and some reptiles have two, and we see all three patterns very, very early in the history of reptiles, almost at the beginning. The anapsid skull is found in turtles. The diapsid skull is found in lizards and snakes, crocodiles, and birds have that. And some early reptiles also had the synapsid skull, but now the only animals that have that are mammals. So that's kind of unusual. So we divide reptiles then into a couple groups. One group is the turtles. They're different from all of the reptiles because they have that anapsid skull, and then they have the body enclosed in a case, which has got a bony case where you've got bone then overlaid by keratin. This is kind of similar to fish. Fish do this kind of stuff. The anapsids all lack teeth, but they have shark beaks. And so these include some very large marine turtles, but it also includes the tortoises and the turtles we are more familiar with, but they all lay their eggs on land. Another unusual group of reptiles that's kind of small like this are the Tuartoras, or Rhynchocephalia, These are large lizard-like animals found only on islands near New Zealand. They have an unusual structure in that they have a third eye that's kind of in the center of their skull, and kind of covered by scales. And they have some other kind of unique structural features. Then the largest group of reptiles are the lizards, the Squamata. This has the copulatory organ, so it has internal fertilization. The majority of these are the snakes, the big group, they lack limbs, and then the lizards. They have the ability to lose their tail, and these guys have the diapsid skull. Also with the diapsid skull are the crocodiles. Okay, these are a small number of species, but really large reptiles. Typically, they're nocturnal. They live in the tropics and subtropics. There are alligators, crocodiles, and garvels. They're well adapted to kind of ambush hunting in aquatic environments. They have their eyes on top of the head, nostrils on top of the snout, a strong neck, and powerful jaws. So there we see some crocodiles. These guys differ from, they have a diapsid skull, but they also differ from lizards and snakes. They have a lot of parental care. They still lay eggs in a nest, but they guard their nest, and they watch over it until the young hatch, and then they care for the young after they hatch. They have an advanced circulatory system with a heart, so that they completely keep separate the blood from the body and from the lungs. And so there's no mixing of that blood. Okay, whoops, we're gonna go there. Let's go here. The crocodiles more properly belong to the archosaurs. These include the dinosaurs, crocodiles, and alligators, and birds. They have this fully divided heart, and they maintain a body temperature that's kind of above the environmental temperature and warm, so we refer to them as endothermic. Many of them have lots of parental care. Many of them have feathers, and they all have hollow bones. So some unusual features. So not only living crocodiles, but many dinosaurs and many birds. Then the third type of skull, that was the mammal skull. That now the only animals that have synapsid skulls are mammals. And they too have the amniotic egg, but in this case they retain it inside the reproductive tract, and the chorion forms a placenta. Okay, and they're unusual in that they have different types of teeth in different parts of the mouth. Okay, and so we see this kind of link with fossil structures, but of course this evidence has also been confirmed using molecular sequence of ribosomal genes. And we have fossil intermediates between living groups, so a really powerful series of pieces of evidence. Okay.